The amendment to the motion be agreed to. I call Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you very much, sir. In starting my contribution, I'd like to acknowledge some of the previous contributors to the debate this afternoon. And I'd just like to thank Barry Coates for acknowledging New Zealand First in our efforts to bring forward legislation to the House, which was only defeated by one vote, and which sought to remove ISDS from all trade agreements that New Zealand entered into. It was a frustrating moment for me personally, sir, as members opposite voted against removing some of the most insidious trade clauses in this country's and the world's history of this movement to so-called trade agreements. I was going to make a contribution or make comment of the Minister's contribution, but it's like he doesn't know what's going on in the rest of the world. He seems to have missed the fact that the one country, perhaps, that will determine whether or not we move forward doesn't want a bar of the TPP. Right. I think the Minister missed the fact that both of the presidential candidates there in the US don't want to touch this because they know how toxic it is to their vote, and they know it's toxic to their vote, sir, because middle-income US citizens will be the worst affected from this trade agreement. And that is reflective of the situation that will arise here in New Zealand also. We acknowledge as a party that there will be some who benefit from this trade agreement. We completely disagree with the data that was brought to the Select Committee in terms of a supposed independent analysis on this trade agreement, but a few will benefit. But, Mr. Speaker, the ledger will not balance out in favour of New Zealand. In fact, it will be quite the opposite. Those in the middle, those in the bottom of our economy struggling already, sir, will be the worst affected. This government has overseen a movement, an increase in inequality unprecedented in our country's history, and it is this very type of international agreement that will further exacerbate it, sir. It will make it worse, and New Zealand First stands up to oppose such moves by this government. I have to say, sir, as I move around the country and talk to people, I know that New Zealanders are tired. And so the family that came to the steps of Parliament today was a bit of motivation for me personally, because I'm tired of having to stand up again and again in opposition of this supposed trade deal. Not called a trade deal, a partnership agreement, because they don't have the audacity to pretend it is a trade deal anymore. So I congratulate that family that made that incredible effort to come up and just highlight yet again, not only is this agreement bad for New Zealanders in the present, it will in fact be harmful to our future generations. But I was heartened by the contributions from the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker, because clearly they're tired too. They, in their deliveries today, were quite morose and quite sad in their contributions, and I think that it is simply a reluctance and a reticence to stand up and defend the indefensible. It must truly drag them down. I do want to say, I agree with them in a lot of parts, but it's more about the fact that we agree, and I quote one of the members from that side of the House, "We are a small country positioned at the bottom of the world. We have a tiny population, and our big opportunities lie when New Zealand companies get opportunities to access middle-income consumers from the world, including the US." Couldn't agree more. The problem is the TPP is absolutely not the vehicle to do this. This is an absolute farce and does not achieve any of the supposed wondrous, the numbers that the current Minister of Trade has given New Zealanders on the gains from the tariff reductions have bordered on preposterous, sir. There are no gains for our dairy industry, or if If we acknowledge that there are some, it's been eloquently summated that it might be to the equivalent of 9 dairy farms in New Zealand. It's farcical, sir, absolutely farcical. So New Zealand First does want to stand up and insist that we are advocates of trade, but we insist with more vehemence, sir, that this is not the vehicle in which to achieve it. We oppose this legislation, this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement Amendment Bill. It is legislation that simply helps this government to curtail, to run up the skirts of some of our bigger partners around the world. It's almost infantile in its blatant attempt to side themselves up with their overseas friends, despite the fact that those friends themselves are not willing to move forward with this agreement. Sir, I commend Mr Retty on his contribution because he actually talked about the legislation. I think he may have been the only one who talked in detail on the legislation itself. So let me speak to some of the issues that arose in this legislation. There were 10 very different and very distinct pieces of legislation, sir. And I've said it before, I said it in the first reading and I said it during Select Committee, that the omnibus approach to passing these pieces of legislation is flawed in its usage here with this legislation, this process, because we've come from an original trade agreement or partnership agreement, I correct myself, that was undertaken mainly in secret. It was moved ahead at a tremendous rate that curtailed much debate that would have been useful and informed perhaps more of the agreement. And so what I have suggested and what I still suggest, Mr Speaker, is that the opportunity to actually take those individual pieces of legislation to individual select committees that are affected by those bits of legislation would have been a great opportunity to delve deeper into the issues. As I think it was Mr Retty himself said, the bulk of the legislation that we looked at wasn't actually submitted on, and I think it was simply because people didn't know the breadth and the depth of legislation that we were having to address. So, look, the US is in a position where they're not moving forward. Vietnam is in a position, despite actually its population supporting the TPP, it's the only country where its population does in the main. The Vietnamese government has said they're not going to move forward. The Canadian government has never actually come out with a position on the TPP, and they're not willing to move forward. So the Japanese, I've just read today as I was waiting for my slot in the House this afternoon, were absolutely adamant in their attempts to move forward to ratify and get the legislation in place. But actually today, apparently, they have stopped that process and they themselves are not willing to move forward. So those two economies represent more than 85% of the GDP of the TPP regions. This TPP agreement will not move forward. So, in conclusion, I once again wish to lodge New Zealand First opposition to the use of the omnibus bill process, and I just want to end on a quote from a former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister. What is involved is the biggest power, wealth and land grab in the history of the world. The benefits do not accrue exclusively to any one country, but it is the wealthiest power elites of the half-dozen largest industrialised countries who are the principal beneficiaries. The middle class and the poor of all of these countries will be the losers, sir. Thank you very much.